Hello students, we are going to look at the concept of work today sociologically. There are standard definitions of what constitutes work in every society. One very common way of defining work is to look at work as physical and mental activities that lead to the transformation of nature and the provision of goods and services. If you judge by this definition, you'd realize that a whole range of activities can be work but does not get recognized as such in society. In order to then understand this complexity of how does work get defined in a particular society, Keith Green provides us an understanding. He states that what counts as work is dependent on the specific social circumstances under which such activities are undertaken, and critically, how these circumstances and activities are interpreted by those involved. Whether any particular activity is experienced as work or leisure, or both or neither, is intimately related to temporal, spatial, and cultural conditions of existence. Now, what does he mean by this? Let us take, for instance, the example of cooking. Now, when you have chefs who cook in restaurants outside and get paid for it, it becomes a part of their work profile and they get money. But the same activity when done at home, generally by women, is not characterized as paid employment or work and is seen as a part of her role. Likewise, say for instance, if you on a spur decide to cook a special meal for your friends, that becomes a part of your leisure activity. But it does not qualify as work. So what you can notice is that the very same activity, that is cooking, depending on when is the activity taking place, where is the activity taking place, and who is doing it and who is witnessing it, right? All these matters define what work is. So then an activity in itself does not tell you whether it is work or not. Rather, work is what is defined by society and social actors. Now, given that work is then a contested cultural phenomena because it has, there are interpretations of meanings that are entailed in what constitutes work. The social organization of work varies from one society to another, and it has also varied across historical periods. So, for our convenience today, we are going to try and look at the social organization of work in three fundamental historical phases, namely the pre-industrial phase, the modern phase, and then the post-industrial phase. I'll begin with, of course, the pre-industrial work. Now, here we are talking about simpler societies, which is societies which were non-industrialized and stateless societies. Now, in this society, there wasn't a distinct economic sphere which could be separated from other aspects of life. So, most of these societies, according to anthropologists, were kinship-based societies, which means it was the kin relation through which a lot of the economic, political, obligations were carried through. So, which is why there was no distinct domain of work. Work was interlaced with religious activity, with social activity, with magical activity, right? So, it was impossible to demarcate a domain of work. In fact, in such societies, a lot of the work that took place was, for instance, tied to aspects of ceremonial gift giving. So say for instance, if you take the example of the Trobriand Islanders, they undertook cultivation, they undertook deep sea fishing, they undertook canoe building, and in all of these activities, a lot of religious rituals were also implicated. And at the same time, very interestingly, being a matrilineal society here, the product of, say, cultivation was not immediately consumed by the men who undertook cultivation. What they did instead was they would go and share it with their sister's husband or with their own brother-in-law. Now, in a certain sense, even the brother-in-law was producing his own set of agricultural produce. But this exchange was important to retain the solidarity between the two groups, the group of the husband and the group of his brother-in-law. So that gives us the sense that it has been difficult in such situations to demarcate work from other domains because these societies were fundamentally undifferentiated. And it seemed that there were a range of activities which were intermeshed with each other. You didn't have a distinct category called work. Now, the idea of a distinct category of work which takes place in a separate domain is something that actually emerges with modernity. And with this, we come to a new phase in human society, which led to a radical reorganization in the way in which people do and experience work. Now, in this phase, one of the first thing that happened was the differentiation of domains, which is that what modern society did was that it had a conception that the economic activity was distinct from political activity, which was distinct from activities which were familial or socio-cultural activities. So then what happened is that the work that took place in a domain called the economic was what get characterized as work per se. And all other social activities in different domains did not constitute work. Now, what was this work in the economic domain? Now, firstly, there was an important shift that took place in modern society, which is that work shifted from the household to the factory site. So you had a specific location of work. Now, not only was there a specific location to work, there were also a new system by which work was carried out. And the system is often, of course, referred to as the system of industrial capitalism. Now, what is the system of industrial capitalism? Now, if we look at the system of industrial capitalism, it involves the production of goods and services for profit. Now, this kind of work, of course, is fundamentally based on a lot of mechanization and the use of advanced machinery. Now, people who have capital invest in this machinery, they own the factory, and they employ workers. Now, this is important to understand that when they employ workers, what they buy from workers is their labor power. So in a modern society, workers are able to sell their labor power to capitalists or factory owners, and in return for wages. It's also important to understand that the wages are never equal to the value that is produced by the worker, which means that a part of the value that is produced is appropriated by the capitalist. This is the surplus value, and it is this that allows the capitalist to make profit. Now, because the wages are never equal to the value that is produced by workers, it was Karl Marx who essentially defined the industrial capitalist system as an exploitative system. Now, in this system, let us try and understand what sort of happens in a factory. Now, the first thing is that you have machines, but you also have a certain intensity of activity, which is that people have to continuously maintain the intensity of activity, and they are supervised. So you have a set of managers who actually ensure that the workers do their work. Now, another aspect of this is that because of the mechanization of work, you have a division of labor, which reduces the work into very specific tasks. Now, because the reduction of work into specific tasks makes the work dull and repetitive, Karl Marx was of the opinion that what workers experience in such a modern workplace can be best termed as alienation. Now, what is this concept of alienation according to Karl Marx? Now, he understands alienation in terms of 4 dimensions. He says that because the worker does not have control over what he produces, it leads to a certain kind of self-estrangement. Alienation means self-estrangement. Now, what are the 4 ways in which this occurs? Firstly, what Marx says is that worker does not have control over the product that he produces, right? Which is that he cannot control it, he cannot use it. This is the first kind of alienation. The second is that the worker has no control over the production process, which is to say that, whatever the supervisors or managers say, he simply follows instructions. So this is another kind of alienation, which is alienation from the production process. The third kind of alienation happens when, as a result of very close supervision, workers are unable to interact with each other, form bonds or solidarities. As a result, he is alienated from his fellow workers, and this Marx understands as alienation from species being. Finally, what happens is, because of the above 3 forms of alienation, from product, from the production process, and from the species being, the worker is not able to utilize his own creative potential. He's not able to be the best that he can be, and this leads to an alienation from the self. So this is how Marx tries to explain work in a modern society, which is that work is fundamentally alienating. Now, why is work alienating? Now, one of the reasons why work becomes alienating is because scientific principles of management were employed to undertake work, to ensure that there was greater efficiency, greater productivity, and greater profitability. One person associated with the application of scientific principles is Frederick Taylor, who was an American business consultant. And what he did was he conducted these time and motion studies, wherein he studied what is the minimum amount of time and effort and movement that a worker needs to undertake a particular task. And the idea was that through cooperation with the managers and heavy supervision, the worker was compelled in this fashion to undertake the task to maintain the intensity of work. Now, of course, what this leads to is that when you're breaking down this work into so many minute parts, what happens is that it leads to a certain kind of de-skilling of labor, which means that a worker does not need any special skills to perform these kinds of work. That makes the worker replaceable, which means that if you do not want to do the work in the terms that the capitalist is asking you to do, you will simply be asked to leave your job. And that pressurizes the person to stick to an alienating job. What this does is, of course, this dehumanizes the entire process of work. Now, what does dehumanization mean? Which means that you start functioning simply as a part of the machine. As Marx put it, a cog in the wheel, right? Now, because of alienation, because of this, intensity of work, the pressures of work, workers did try to resist. And so in the early phase in modern societies, there was a lot of industrial conflict, which means that the workers and managers, the workers and the capitalists came into conflict with each other. And then you had a whole set of strikes, lockouts, stoppage of work, right? So in order to stabilize the system then, there had to be certain efforts taken. Now, one of the ways in which the system of modern work was stabilized was through some of the procedures that were initiated by Henry Ford. Now, Henry Ford, of course, as the name suggests, is famous for his automobile industry. Now, what Henry Ford did was he applied Taylor's principles of scientific management and he improved the nature of technology in the factory. So what he established is referred to as the assembly line production. So in the assembly line production, what happens is that, again, the production of a product takes place in parts. And there is a conveyor belt which links each parts to the other, and you have workers placed at particular distances in the conveyor belt who are doing the most menial and repetitive of tasks, right? So say, for instance, he produced a standardized product, which is the Ford T car model, and he used this assembly line production. Now, when he did this, for an assembly line production, you need to produce a particular product in large numbers. So there has to be mass production. Now, mass production, of course, then requires mass markets. Now, how do you create mass markets? How do you ensure that everybody is going to buy that same car that you're producing? Now, one way in which Ford ensured this was that he increased the wages of the worker by $5. Now, just this mere increase by $5 had a lot of very interesting consequences. One is that this ensured the sales of his own car. Secondly, what it did is that I just mentioned that there was a lot of conflict between the workers and the capitalists. Because their salaries or wages were increased, this led to a reduction in conflicts and gave a certain kind of stability to the workforce and the working environment. And because of this, what happened then was that the system of capitalism stabilized. Right? So we're talking about, say, after the Second World War in the 1950s, what happened is the assembly line production ensured enormous amount of profits, worker stability, and the state here played a very important role in coordinating business, keeping price and competition at check, providing welfare services like education and health to the citizens, and ensuring that it creates a healthy workforce willing to work, right? And what this ensured was profitability and affluence of society. Now, it's important to then understand that by the 1950s, you had the American white middle class life, which flourished as a result of Fordism. But that does not mean that there was no inequality or workers' problems have been dealt with. What actually happened is a lot of these inequalities got transferred to racial and ethnic minorities. So while whites had more stable lives, Black Americans, other ethnic minorities continued to struggle in this system. It did not, of course, cater to everyone and benefit everyone. Another aspect of inequality that can be seen in modern society is that of the spatial division of labor, which is that because modern work entailed a shift from the household to the factory site, we have to think about what happened to the household, right? So this space gets regarded as the private space, and this becomes a space for women's activity, for feminine activity, and this work gets devalued. So the work that women do at home is not acknowledged as work, whereas the work that was done in factory sites, and they were often done by men, gets acknowledged as work. So in turn, what happens is a new kind of ideology is produced, which is that men should go out and work and be breadwinners in a family, and women should stay at home and care for the children. Now, obviously, because the two domains, which is the domain of the family and the domain of the work, were not equal, because you had a lot of rewards if you worked, but you had no acknowledgement of the work that women did. So this led to a certain kind of gender inequality as well. Now, following a decade or two, by the 1970s, what happened is that everything that was working in favor of the Fordist system of assembly line production actually sort of became difficult to sustain. Now, one of the reasons was, of course, what is referred to as stagflation. Now, stagflation basically means a situation where there was low economic growth, right, which means that there wasn't enough demand because there was a price rise. It is also associated with an oil crisis that took place in the Middle East, which sort of, made global prices go haywire, which is why there was stagflation. And then it was realized that these Fordist systems are becoming inefficient and uneconomical in that sense. As a result of this, this problem with the Fordist system actually led to a new way in which work began to be reorganized. At the same time, during this period, what happened was there was the continuous innovation in terms of technology, right? And especially from the 1970s, you had the development of communication technologies. Communication technologies actually played a very important role in making possible the transformation of work that took place from the 70s in order to respond to the problems of the modern Fordist system of work. And this new transformation of work has been referred to as post-Fordism. Some people also choose to call it Neo-Fordism because they say this represents a maturation of modern form of work rather than a radical shift from the modern form of work. Now, what are the specific things that are associated with post-Fordist form of work? Now, some of the things are, of course, the production and distribution at a global scale. Now, what this basically means is that if in the case of modern work, you were producing goods for, say, local markets or at best national markets, you now start producing goods and services for a global market, which means you're going to sell across the world, right? It also then means other forms of practices, namely mass customization, flexible specialization, rise of multinational corporations, and less hierarchical firms. Now, I'm going to elaborate on all of this. Now, in the first instance, what happened, let's look at the factory site. I'd already told you about what was the nature of work in a factory site, how alienating it was, how jobs were very repetitive. Now, because of technology, what happens, a lot of job got subsumed within technology. Because there was technology, you did not need laborers to do certain kinds of tasks because machines could do it themselves. So then what happened was, what you needed then was not workers with less skills, but you needed highly skilled labor who could actually operate, program these technologies and the software that were required to be programmed. So here there was a radical change. So instead of de-skilled labor, you started employing highly skilled labor who were extremely educated, and they would come together in teams of 5 or 20 and resolve problems of production, design, distribution. And these would be called quality circles. Now, quality circles, because everyone was highly skilled, did not require supervision as such. So there was more autonomy, there was more initiative. But interestingly, at the same time, there was a lot of peer competition and pressure to sort of meet up the various deadlines. So the factory started looking different. It started looking more egalitarian. And you also had, however, a range of peripheral part-time contractual workers. So there was like a division between the workers' profile in a factory. You had two sets now. You had highly skilled core workers and peripheral workers who got their jobs depending on the needs, and they lost their jobs. They were hired and fired as and when. They did not have social security, right? Another important aspect of this change in the factory system is that this change actually was manifested at a global level, and it led to what has been referred to as a global division of labor. So earlier, what would happen in a Fordist system was that from the procuring of raw materials to the production, to the distribution, and to the sales, everything would happen in-house, which is, it would happen in that big, huge factory that was there to produce goods, standardized goods at a very large scale. But what happened with the global division of labor is that these organizations started to subcontract, which means part of their activities would be sourced out to other countries which had cheap source of labor or cheaper raw materials. So what happens is then the Fordist system starts to disintegrate, as it were, which means that the same company which is located in America can now employ people to work for them from states like, say, Bangladesh, India, African countries, right? And they do so because they can get much cheaper labor. The amount that they would have to pay to an American would be far more than what they can pay to these people in Asia and African states. Now, because of this, what happens is that while the high-skilled workers of, sort of who are there in the Western countries, they work in good environments, egalitarian environments, less supervision. You have another set of people who work in deplorable conditions, in sweatshops, where they struggle, where there is no work-life balance, where they are paid a very meager amount, and sometimes it also involves child labor. So what happened then, the organization of work started looking different. So on one hand, you had these medium-sized firms who were producing very high quality goods, and they were supported by the state at a local level to be able to sort of, market these goods all over the world, right? And this is associated with, of course, mass customization. Now, what is mass customization? It means that each product can cater to the needs of a specific market. Because of information technology, it was possible to continuously alter the specifications of a product. The best example would be the Dell laptop. So in case of a Dell laptop, Dell was not producing a single specific kind of a laptop which it was then selling to others. Rather, it was the people who were configuring the laptop that they wanted, and then Dell would produce it together and sell it. So this was very different from the way in which Fordist production produced standardized goods, right? But alongside, in some sense, this diversification of the firm across the globe, you also had the emergence of multinational corporations, which means corporations which have this process all over the world, and they have enormous power. And because they have enormous power and enormous wealth, sometimes more than the wealth of the GDP, it's very difficult for the state to control these MNCs. And what these MNCs do is that they're interested mostly in making profits for themselves, and they are only interested in reducing costs. They do not care necessarily about the workers. They do not care about, say, the workers who are suffering in sweatshops. They are only interested in their profits. So what MNCs do is they distribute inequality at a global level. Now, other ways in which one has tried to understand the post-Fordist work is also through concepts like a knowledge-based economy. Because in post-Fordist work, a lot of labor is invested in providing services which does not require the production of tangible goods. So basically, a lot of time is spent in research, design, development, marketing, and sales, and not actually producing the good. So a lot of people make money by simply as sort of scholars say, doing nothing related to actual production. Another way of seeing the post-Fordist society is to see it as a network society, because you see, because of communication technology, it is possible to communicate remotely across various parts of the world and get work done. So you may be sitting in India trying to provide customer service at a very different time zone to Americans, so on and so forth. So this is made possible with the sort of post-Fordist work. Now, this has an impact for the profile of the worker and the one who does the job. So if earlier mostly labor was de-skilled or it was highly specialized, today the concern is to try and get motivated workers who are team players, who are ready to adapt and innovate and take initiative. So this involves firms undertaking on-the-job training for the workers and promoting what is called soft skills, which is innovation, adaptability, and the ways of interacting with each other in sort of a certain fashion, because the idea is that a lot of work is not about production, but it is about providing services, it is about customer care, etc. So on-the-job training, multi-skilling becomes important. A very interesting aspect of post-Fordist form of work is the feminization of the workforce. So from the 70s onwards, what you see is that a large number of women start participating in the sphere of work. And interestingly, a lot of their work looks very similar to what they did in their households, which is it involves emotional labor. So you see customer care services, air hostessing, and these kinds of works are something where you see a concentration of women. But even though many women are joining work, what we see is that they remain concentrated at lower levels. They generally tend to do contractual or part-time jobs, and also the experience wage gap, which is that they are not paid the same amount as men for the same kind of job. Another aspect is that a lot of these women, as they join work, they experience a glass ceiling, which is they cannot rise up the ladder. And one reason for it is also the kind of sexual harassment that they experience at the workplace. So what we can see is that even though the nature of work changes from one form to the other, it continues to produce certain kinds of inequalities, right? And there is always certain kinds of activities which gets excluded out. And then, of course, there is some kind of resistance. So say, for instance, today we have feminists who continue to point out that, we must acknowledge the work that women do at home. One must understand is that when one is trying to understand work historically or culturally, one needs to understand that it is always a contested phenomenon, that there will be dominant perspectives of it, but that will always exclude certain activities which technically may qualify as work, but society does not recognize it as such, and that can produce its own kinds of exclusion and inequalities. Thank you.